understand. A man's got to make whatever he wants and take it with his own hands. Poor people stay poor people and they never get to see. Someone's got to win in the human race. If it isn't you, then it has to be me. So smile while you're making it. Laugh while you're taking it. Even though you're faking it, nobody's gonna know. Nobody's gonna know. No use mumbling, it's no use grumbling. Life just...
Another now. The song that you just heard was my introduction to recalcitrant, toxic, barbaric neoliberalism. Of course, it's by Alan Price, who's a wonderful man, but this is the soundtrack he wrote for Oh Lucky Man, which was a kind of depiction of, back in 1976, if I remember correctly, of the neoliberalism that Maggie Thatcher would bring a few years later to Britain, followed up by Ronald Reagan in 1980 in the United States. So, welcome to Another Now, the program that owes its existence to a mindless virus that managed to do something that not even the Second World War managed to do, that is to place capitalism in suspended animation. There's no doubt that most people are longing for a return to normality. However, Another Now is a program which is asking all of us to desist from longing for normality, because there was no such thing as normality. I shall quote from the wonderful Indian writer Arundhati Roy, who was actually writing in, of all places, the Financial Times, the following words. I feel like sharing with those with you before I introduce you to our special guest tonight. So Roy was writing a few days ago, or maybe a week ago, in the Financial Times. Okay, here it is. Our minds are still racing back and forth, longing for a return to normality, trying to stitch our future to our past and refusing to acknowledge the rapture. But the rapture exists. And in the midst of this terrible despair, it offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves. Nothing could be worse than a return to normality. Historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine the world anew. This one is no different. It is a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly, with light luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. Well, tonight, to help us imagine another world, another now, and to be ready to fight for it, I have a remarkable guest. I want to thank her in advance for agreeing to interrupt her very busy Zooming schedule to be with us tonight. Her name is Stephanie Kelton. Stephanie is a friend, a comrade, a fellow economist who also made the rather rash choice that I made a few years ago to enter into the political sphere, to join Bernie Sanders' campaign as her economic advisor, to continue to write and to fight, as we all should do. Stephanie Kelton, it is my great honor and joy to have you here tonight. Welcome to Another Now.
Thank you so much. It's super fun to have an hour to spend with you, Giannis.
So Stephanie, look, we've already received an avalanche of questions for you, but I'm not going to start that way, because I think it's very important to humanize things. This is what we really miss in this world. So why don't you begin by, what were your early influences in life? I mean, read economics at some point in California, I believe. Then you moved to Cambridge. And when you went back to the United States, you became a professor, an economic advisor. But how did that start? I mean, what was it in your childhood and in your teenage years that created the impetus for all this?
Honestly, it's almost like a series of accidents. But for one chance encounter in the right economics class while studying something else, I wouldn't have met Professor John Henry, who became so influential in my economic training and the kinds of things that the questions that I asked, the things that I read, the people that I went on to study with, where I went on to study. I mean, it was, I grew up a military brat. My father was in the Air Force. We moved around constantly. I had 3 first grades, 3 8th grades, 3 high schools. We lived all over the place, never had time to really form attachments in a lot of ways. And college was something that I didn't really give a lot of thought to in advance, not in terms of the things that I wanted to study, the questions I was interested in. Everything happened by sort of accident. So I think I changed my major 7 or 8 times. And at one point I was studying finance and accounting, and you had to take some economics as part of that degree program. And that's where I met John Henry, who is a very serious thinker. And he had me begin a reading program outside of the regular classroom lectures, having me read things like Lewis Henry Morgan, Robert Briffaut. I mean, I was Veblen, the war essays. I mean, he was giving me all this kind of heavy stuff. And I think it was really through the history of economic thought that my juices got turned on. And that's when economics became something that I had to do. And I did it alongside a finance degree, but that's sort of the rough background.
Yeah, well, you were lucky, weren't you? Because most students of economics have to suffer the dry textbook that condenses 5,000 years of knowledge into one aphorism, to be rationalist, to maximize utility subject to constraints. And
I was very, I was very lucky. Even, ending up at Cal State Sacramento, which was itself an accident. I was going to attend the University of North Carolina. We had been stationed in North Carolina my senior year of high school. And then my father decided kind of suddenly that he was done, that he was going to retire and the family would be moving back to California for, to live. And I had to decide whether to stay in North Carolina by myself or, at the age of barely 17, follow them back to California, having missed all the application deadlines and all that kind of stuff. So that's how I ended up going through that program and ultimately ending up at Cal State Sacramento in an economics department. While there were conventional neoclassically trained economists, there were also institutionalists, a long legacy of institutionalists. Mark Toole was there, John Henry, some Marxists, some post-Keynesian types. So I got lucky in a number of ways from an early stage in my training.
Was your family political? Were you political?
No.
How did that happen then?
The history of economic thought. I mean, honestly, I think that one of the earliest memories I have that was sort of jarring and just reset my worldview in a lot of ways was sitting in that history of economics thought class with John Henry and having him ask the simplest question I have ever heard: can everyone be a capitalist? Of course, that's the American dream, right? You work hard and you become your own boss and you make your own rules and everybody, of course, until you realize that capitalists hire workers. And so in order for there to be capitalists, there also have to be workers. And so not everyone can be. And I just remember that having a real impact on the way I thought about outcomes, economic outcomes, societal outcomes, and justice, and just a whole variety of things sort of reset in my own mind just by him asking that simple question.
And of course, the answer to that question is really that the answer is yes, only in the kind of models that economists teach, where everybody is a little Robinson Crusoe, selling something, whether it is labor tokens or fish or hooks or whatever, only in that kind of economic model where there's no capital really, and there's no labor. Can you have a situation where you can pretend that there is a kind of capitalism, which of course is not capitalism, it's just an exchange economy. This is why, when I try to impress upon students about the total unrealism and yet beauty of what they were being taught, I would teach them the 1945 article by Radford on the prisoners of war camp, where, they're all sitting around, they're all prisoners of war somewhere in Germany, RAF pilots, US Air Force pilots, and so on. And, they just trade between themselves, a little bit of tea and a little bit of chocolate and a few cigarettes that they get from the Red Cross passes. That is the kind of economy that students are taught in university, right? But there's no capitalism, there's no production, there's no labor. Oops, you muted yourself. Suddenly you muted yourself. There you
are. That's exactly right. If everyone is their own petty producer, individually capable of subsisting on their own output, then it's not the kind of capitalism we talk about, but it holds in that stylized framework. So yeah, it doesn't work.
And the thing about these prisoners of war camp, I think it's also important because you have a theory of money in there, because cigarettes emerge as money. But that money has nothing to do with the money that we are familiar with. So this confusion of cigarettes for the money that we have in our pockets or on a credit card or debit card, that is a confusion that is so easy to fall for, and yet so detrimental to our understanding of what the hell is going on around us. And you've been exemplary in pointing this out.
Yeah, I mean, so many stories, as you well know in economics, are taught as if we're teaching fairy tales to young children. It's like once upon a time, man conducted his affairs through barter exchange. Once upon a time, this sort of story, this stylized abstracting from anything that's historical, ignoring the work of anthropologists, of sociologists, of numismatists, the people who really study these questions. Economists simply wave their hands around, say, it's the can opener. Imagine two people, a Robinson and a Crusoe. Imagine that they're trying to solve a problem through barter. Now imagine that over a period of time, they discover that they can handle these problems more efficiently if they invent something to serve as an intermediary in the exchange process. So, shells and beads and feathers and all these things that were supposed to be primitive money things. And then over time, they get really wise and they discover that precious metals can work because they have these very nice characteristics. They're portable, they're durable, they're divisible. So they make a very nice token money item, but all along ignoring the role of private property, the role of the state in developing markets, the role of the state in making and shaping a monetary system, and telling students that this all comes about through some spontaneous order as agents look for more efficient ways to carry out exchange, so that we get money as an outgrowth of a barter economy through people just seeking greater efficiencies.
Yeah, one commodity emerging as the unit of account. When did you start understanding money? Because money is such a quite quasi spiritual kind of commodity or item or entity. Marx referred to it as the alienated capacity of humans. I think that's the most poetic, for me at least, depiction of what it is. It's power. It's an abstracted, alienated capacity. But it's very difficult, especially for a young person, to wrap their mind around it. You know, what is really money? I mean, not so much the techniques of how is it produced by overdraft facilities, by the private banks, by the Fed, but when did you start wrapping your mind around the concept of money, feeling that you were getting a handle on its meaning?
Well, I guess I probably would say I started in 1996 while studying with Randy Ray at the University of Denver, just before heading over to Cambridge. Randy had written a book called Money and Credit in Capitalist Economies. So I was introduced to the sort of post-Keynesian way of thinking about money as credit, as a credit instrument. And then I got to Cambridge and gosh, I mean, I started reading things like Jeff Ingham, who's a sociology professor at Cambridge University, and he had a paper that was very influential on me way back in the day called Money as a Social Relation. Money as a social relation. So a relationship between debtors and creditors, rather than defining money as a thing or defining money by the way it works or functions, treating money as a relationship, as a social relationship. And I sort of started thinking about money that way. Keynes in the treatise on money has some treatment along these lines where he starts to talk about a specific type of money, state money, and saying that the state has the power to write and rewrite the dictionary, to name the unit in which debts will be denominated, prices will be written, contracts will be written. The state has the power to define the unit, and he says to rewrite the dictionary at will over time, which of course, maybe no one better than you knows about the state's power to rewrite the dictionary, because the Greek dictionary was rewritten, of course, from the drachma to the euro. That's a perfect example of the authority exercising its power to rewrite the dictionary, to change the unit in which payments will be made, collected, obligations, debts, contracts, and so forth. So I guess...
When you mentioned Cambridge and having been exposed to the idea of money as a social relation, you brought memories of two things that were completely at odds with one another in my own experience or history. One was, I was introduced at a very young age, 14, 15, to the concept of capital as a social relationship by Marx. And I remember that story, which is, it's not a myth, it's a true story of an Englishman who had some money. He made a mint out of some kind of stock exchange upheaval, and he chartered 3 ships, and he filled them with proletarians and with equipment and so on, took them to Australia. You know the story, eh? And they ended up in Western Australia. And suddenly he realized that his capital was worthless because these workers simply moved on. There was so much land and they became farmers of their own. So suddenly he had no hold over them. He had no power over them. There was no social relationship. His monopoly of tools was not enough for a capital-labor relationship to exist. So suddenly, that's the first thing you reminded me of capital as a social relation. And of course, if capital is a social relation, so is money. The second thing was, when I went to Cambridge, unfortunately, I was stuck with economists. Unlike you, I was with economists because I was an economist. And I didn't meet a single person that had anything interesting to say about money, debt, or economics for that matter, because I was stuck with economists.
So was I. I mean, I was there in the graduate program in economics. It just so happened that I was stumbling across these papers and that there were conferences organized and people like Jeff Hodgson would come. There was Tony Lawson, who was in the economics department and still I think is, and yes. He would hold these Monday night, I think every Monday.
Tony is only there because he teaches econometrics, which he hates. Yeah. So he's there teaching something that he doesn't care for in order to do that which he cares for, which is really interesting, isn't it?
It's funny. Well, I did take the economics, the econometrics while I was at Cambridge, but he was not the one teaching it at the time. But he did hold these Monday night kind of seminars And that was something I always looked forward to. It was critical realism is what he called the, I guess, right, shaping philosophy. But he was sort of interesting that I didn't take a course from him. I took a course from Michael Kuczynski, who was very Minsky-like, right? He did finance. And so I got to think about money and ways that were familiar to me from studying with Randy. But for the most part, it was a very conventional economics department at that time.
So back to the United States after the Cambridge experience, doing a PhD at New School, I believe, which is, you know, a very unique place, of course, in the United States. I'm so glad it's still alive and kicking. But there aren't that many places like New School where you could actually write a PhD of the sort that you did, right?
Yeah, that's definitely true. I mean, I got to teach there last spring. The dean, you probably know Will Milberg. Will reached out to me and said, we want you to come teach a PhD course on MMT. And I thought, oh, you know, I'm a full-time faculty member here at Stony Brook University. And I said, oh, Will, I have a full load. It's just, and he just twisted and twisted. And I thought, it's my alma mater. It's an opportunity to teach this, you know, body of scholarship that I love and help contribute to over the years. And so I did it, and it was so terrific. I mean, those students are it's a very special program. It's a special place.
So what was that before you got involved with Bernie Sanders and the campaign and being his economic advisor?
Yeah, this was spring of 2019. So January of last year, I started just one, you know, I took the train into the city once a week, taught my PhD class and came back and taught here. But so it was after.
So, okay, I mentioned Bernie Sanders. There is an almighty clash for, you know, minds and souls and hearts and so on and so forth. I'm reading now, I'm going to read something from the Financial Times that was published a few days ago. This is the conclusion of an article written by Erana Foruhar, a Financial Times reporter or writer. And she finishes off her article saying, by the way, the title, I think, is going to, you know, bring shivers down our spines. We are entering the new age of American austerity. I'll read the concluding paragraph and just ask you to comment on it. Ultimately, debt is a national burden shared by all taxpayers, she says. Policymakers, therefore, need to think about how to incentivize savings. Trimming every unproductive debt and leverage loophole from the tax code is a good place to start. In time, the Fed will also have to explain how it would shrink all that debt off its balance sheet. And everyone will have to think about thrift. Enter the new age of American austerity. Stephanie Kelton, the floor is yours.
You mean this one?
Yes, indeed.
I did not use my Professor Red ink, but you can tell that it's very marked up. I have graded this. It is an F. It's obviously, you know, it's obviously very disappointing from my vantage point. I think that it is full of, you know, tropes and misunderstandings, and that, you know, it's leaning very heavily into the austerity direction. It is paving the groundwork, laying the groundwork for what is inevitable at the end of all of this, which is I think, a glance over the shoulder at the accumulated deficits that we will have as a legacy of dealing with the health pandemic and the economic fallout associated with that. And people are going to say, okay, you know, we had to do that, but now there's a huge price to pay. There's a tremendous burden, as you said, right? How are we going to deal with the debt burden? Who's going to pay? You know, there's going to be pain associated with all of this going forward. What are we going to do? And so I'm actually working on a piece for the FT right now. They want it here in the next couple of days, and it's on this question: should we worry about the debt? And it's a head-to-head debate over this. And obviously I've been asked to take the position that no, we should not be wrapping ourselves in knots to try to figure out, how best to move forward with an austerity program as we come out of the other side of this eventually. So, I think that I say this all the time. For most countries, we do not have a debt problem. We do not have a debt crisis. What we have is a communication problem, a language problem. It is the fact that we use language, we describe using words like borrowing and debt and deficits. And the fact that we use these words to describe what's really taking place in terms of the government's budget and the ways in which government spending is financed just triggers for people a response that all of the things that we're doing are inherently dangerous, risky, ill-advised, irresponsible. So, the MMT position flips all of these things around. We recognize that when governments sell bonds, governments that are issuing their own currency, okay, the US, the UK, Australia, Canada, so forth. If you're a country that has what we say in MMT is a sovereign currency, fiat currency, not tied to gold, not convertible into anything else, borrowing in a currency that you and only you can issue, there's never a reason for a government in that position to borrow its own currency, to need to borrow its own currency. And so what we have are governments that by habit pair their deficit spending by selling bonds. So if the government is engaged in deficit spending, spend 100 into the economy, tax 90 back out, we label that a deficit. And people think that there's something inherently wrong with that. There's nothing inherently wrong with government running a budget deficit, fiscal deficit. Government deficit is nothing more than a financial contribution to some other part of the economy. So right now, the US government is making about $3 or $4 trillion in a financial contribution to some other part of the US economy to support the economy. When it runs a deficit, it matches the deficit spending by auctioning treasuries. Okay, and we do that by custom. We don't have to do it, but Congress chooses to do that. And so what happens is, as the government engages in deficit spending, it holds up these treasury bonds and it says, I'm going to match up my deficit spending by selling these bonds. And we label it borrowing. And because we call it borrowing, it sounds risky. It sounds like the government is dependent on people, savers in that article. People who have dollars have to finance the government. MMT says no. The deficit has already been financed. The government is running $1 trillion deficit. The deficit deposits the dollars into the economy that are then available to buy the bonds that the government is selling. So I don't look at it as borrowing. I look at it as recycling. The deficit puts the dollars into the economy and the treasuries recycle the dollars into interest-bearing dollars. So when the government sells the treasuries, it pulls the non-interest-bearing dollars back out of the economy. It replaces them with some interest-bearing dollars that we unfortunately call the national debt. It's really just part of the net money supply of the US, but we use these words like the debt to describe what's happening. And then people get very twisted around and agitated by the idea of a government running its finances imprudently. They say households don't do that. Households have to live within their means. Households can't go on borrowing year after year, piling on debt. Therefore, if we see the government behaving that way, it is de facto evidence of, fiscal irresponsibility. And I just think the whole entire narrative is getting things backwards, essentially.
It's what people like Tony Lawson that you mentioned before, but also right-wingers or libertarians like Deirdre McCloskey would say that this is a question of the rhetoric that is being used and the metaphors, the allegories used. So it is really fantastic, is it not, that when people talk about, when the Financial Times writers speak of debt, what they mean is public debt, but they always ignore private debt. And you know, when you say to common folk, hang on a second, you know, if the government does not push public debt up, imagine how many bankruptcies there are going to be and how much bad private debt we're going to end up with. So, you know, how about worrying about the total amount of debt, private and public, and then suddenly it's a question of balancing the two. Then it's easier to make them think. But allow me to ask an impertinent question. I'm not going to talk about the Eurozone because the Eurozone does not fall under your remit as an MMTer because we don't have a sovereign currency, or Greece doesn't have, Germany doesn't have. We have created a monster where we have a central bank without a state to have its back, without a treasury, and we have 19 treasuries without a central bank. I mean, you know, if you really try to create a gigantic recession-creating machine, you couldn't do better than that. But let's forget the Eurozone. Go to Britain, that you mentioned as one of your examples. A critic would say, hang on, Stephanie, in 1976, Britain, even though they were borrowing in pounds, in sterling, they had a crunch. They had to go cap in hand to the International Monetary Fund because at that point, the deficit had run out of control and there was a run on the pound, and interest rates at which the government was borrowing were shooting through the roof, and the government was lost, and they had to go to the IMF and spend 2 years with austerity. What do you say to that?
Well, we've actually written about this. So whoever is asking the question, I'll try not to give another long-winded lecture sort of answer, but you can find this in the MMT literature. And so what we're very careful, I think, to do in MMT is to say that we're talking about countries that issue their own floating currency, fiat floating currency, borrowing their own currency. And what you had in that period is the British government attempting essentially to circumvent the normal protocol and manage its exchange rate at the same time. So you didn't have the situation that MMT describes, which is a freely floating currency. You had a government that was committed to actively trying to manage the value of the pound. The British government did not go to the IMF hat in hand because it needed pounds, because it needed the British pound. Clearly, it is the source of, and the issuer was still the issuer of the currency. There was something different going on in that moment, and it had to do with a desire to continue to try to manage the value of the currency rather than allowing it to float freely, which is part of what MMT requires as part of a definition of monetary sovereignty.
Well, let me speak as a Greek for a moment, because I remember when I was a young person and we still had the drachma, and I wish we still had it, by the way. Let me make this clear. The euro was a catastrophe for everyone. But besides that, being a small economy that was always deficit prone, trade deficit, and therefore always relying on the kindness of strangers, in other words, capital flows into the country to stabilize it, its trade deficit, which was structural. Especially after we entered the European common market, which meant that we couldn't have an industry policy that protected local business, local industry by means of tariffs and so on. Governments were, running around like headless chicken, struggling to prevent a run on the drachma. Even though they didn't really care very much about keeping the drachma at a certain level, they were not managing the currency, but nevertheless, the runs of the drachma were quite extraordinary, and a country that needed, to import oil, a dependent country. That was an experience which was significant in convincing even the Greek working class of the importance of shifting from the drachma to the euro. On the basis that, trades unions would get together and would organize a 5-month strike, they would give a 5% pay rise, then the drachma would collapse. Then, not because of the strike, but it would collapse anyway. And then within 5 days, they would have lost all the gains from the strike. And at some point, when the bourgeoisie turned around and said to them, look, let's go to the euro, because, you can at least be certain that whatever it is that you earn, you will keep on earning. And we will not have to live in this fear of a run on the drachma. What do you say to them?
Well, it is true. You don't have to live in fear of a run on the drachma. That much is true. But you live in fear of other things, right? You live in fear of ending up in a situation where you are forced to borrow, to run your policy, to orient your domestic macroeconomic policies in a way that doesn't best serve your people. And that you have put yourself in a position where you have to take marching orders from the Troika and whomever else is responsible for throwing you a lifeline in times of crises. So you're vulnerable, but you are, of course, correct. And the point of MMT is not to say that every country that keeps its own currency and even floats its currency can always exercise unilateral authority over its domestic policy agenda. In the book that I have coming out in June, I have a chapter on trade, and I try really hard to make this point clear that small open economies, even those that have a floating currency and control their own central bank and so forth, can be extremely vulnerable and can have to run their policies in a way that is highly restrictive when it comes to fiscal policy for fear of, sharp movements in the exchange rate, interest rate policy. I mean, there are situations where not every country, even if it has its own currency, can take full advantage of that currency because there are other sort of sticking points. And if you are a country that is highly dependent on the rest of the world for critical imports, if you need energy, if you need food, if you need technology and medicine from the rest of the world and you don't produce it domestically, and the only way to get it is to import it, and you've got to have a currency other than your own in order to be able to acquire those things, then yeah, you are in a seriously vulnerable position when it comes to your domestic capabilities.
So what would you say to someone who says, well, MMT is great if you live in a country that has the exorbitant power of the dollar to back it up?
Well, look, I think I would say Japan, okay? Japan is not the US. It is not the global reserve currency. Neither is Australia. But these are countries that fit the mold well enough to be able to, I'll keep saying, orient their domestic policy agenda around achieving full employment. Let's put that at the most important thing, let's say, that a government can do. Manage the inflation rate, sustain full employment. In other words, if you are Japan, if you are Australia, and you say, I have all of this unemployment domestically, I have people who are seeking paid work in the state's unit of account, in yen, in Australian dollars, I can afford to hire all of the idle labor and employ it and put it to work serving the public purpose. I can do that domestically. And so I'm not the global reserve currency. I'm the Canadian government, I'm the Australian government, I'm Japan. I can still do that. So you don't have to be the global currency hegemon to run policy oriented toward, let's say, sustaining full employment domestically.
Yeah. I have a little quibble on the difference between Australia and Japan. Australia is highly dependent on the commodities markets because it's a deficit economy primarily, whereas Japan is quite different in the sense that it's got a much more stable balance of payments, but that's neither here nor there. I have a question for you that has come from one of our viewers regarding social policy. Now, MMTers like yourself, on the one hand, and I understand that entirely, especially in the case of countries like the United States or Japan, you're talking about the importance of not being weighed down by the fear of deficit and so on. Fund a jobs guarantee program. And of course, I would completely support that. And DiEM25, our movement, with the help of Jamie Galbraith, one of your folks, has adopted the jobs guarantee program. But can you tell me, why is there a certain aversion to the idea in parallel of something like a universal basic income? That is the question that is coming to you.
I don't think that there is. And I think that if you read Pavlina Chernova, if you look at what Randy Ray has written, if you look at some of the things that I've said, some of the things that Fadel Kaboub has written. There is enough in the MMT community, I think, where people have laid out a parallel argument, how the two could work together. So I don't think that we view them as necessarily antagonistic to one another. I think where we have had concerns is where they have become one versus the other, people who prefer a universal basic income to a job guarantee. We think that the job guarantee has a number of advantages, one of the more important being that it is countercyclical, so that the spending itself is moderating, right, with changing conditions in the underlying economy. And we think that's a very good feature of the job guarantee, whereas the UBI would just layer on the same payment through the business cycle and not have that countercyclical stabilizing aspect. The other thing is, you know, there isn't a UBI proposal. Every time somebody asks me to comment on the UBI, I have to immediately say, well, what is your version? What is it you're proposing? Because, you know, here in the US, probably the version that got the most attention over the last year was the version proposed by presidential candidate Andrew Yang.
Yeah.
And that was a version that I personally spoke out very strongly against. And maybe this question comes from someone who saw me, you know, at times be a very sharp critic of that proposal, because the way that it was introduced, it would have required people who are already receiving certain forms of public assistance do the math, as he put it, and to run the numbers and figure out whether you would rather keep what you have or give up certain forms of public assistance in order to take this monthly disbursement. And whereas somebody like me, who isn't receiving any of those forms of public assistance, I don't have to do the math. I have the luxury of just saying, oh, send me the money, right? So it's the poor who forced into a situation where they have to run the calculation and decide, do I want the UBI payment, or do I want to continue to receive the assistance that I'm getting from state, federal, maybe local government? So I didn't like that.
We are on the same page here. We would completely reject that. DiEM25's position on universal basic income of sorts has been that we do not want this to be tax funded, number one. It is a silly idea to say to a working class blue collar worker, I'm going to take some of your money and give it to rich people, or to people who are sitting on a couch by choice to watch television. So that would be toxic politically and also unnecessary. What's the point of taxing in order to give a universal basic income? So point number one. So where does the money come from? Our proposal for Europe, we ran on this platform last year in the European Parliament elections, and we'll keep doing it because we like the idea, and unless you convince us otherwise. We've been saying, okay, firstly, we are thinking in terms of a universal basic dividend, to say to large companies, if you want to operate in our country, you are going to have to give 10% of your shares to a European equity fund, and the dividends that accumulate there are dispersed in the form of universal basic dividend on the basis that your capital is socially produced. If you're Google, if you're Amazon, and so on, or Facebook, we are all contributing to your capital, and you're only collecting the dividends. So this is also a way of redistributing not so much wealth, but redistributing property rights over companies whose capital is socially produced. Of course, the money that will trickle down to individuals is very small, but as automation increases, that increases as well. And also to supplement this with helicopter money, with the European Central Bank, and that is, compatible with your notion of automatic stabilizers, puts a certain amount of money, adds a certain amount of money to each person's universal basic dividend, depending on aggregate demand. So, for instance, during the coronavirus lockdown, boosted by $2,000-3,000 or euros, for that matter, to replace the lost incomes during this time, and then when things take off, reduce it again. So, this is the kind of thing we have. But okay, so we've covered jobs guarantees and basic incomes or dividends. What was it like to be working with Bernie Sanders during this brilliant but unsuccessful campaign?
Well, It's tough, Giannis. I mean, you see someone who, in so many ways, is, this is my personal opinion, the right man for the moment. And you just see it slip through your fingers. And, you know, and only months after he makes the decision, or nearly weeks after he makes the decision to, you know, step back to endorse Joe Biden, Vice President Biden for president, then all of this unfolds with the coronavirus. And you have so many people now saying that the coronavirus has revealed all of these vulnerabilities. It has laid them bare, whether it's our healthcare system, our trade policies, which have given rise to the fact that we can't produce a face mask or a ventilator or a test kit. And we have supply chain issues. And Bernie's been talking about trade for 35 years, whether it's you know, minimum wage, whether it's discrimination and inequality. It's all of these things that formed the core of his campaign, now twice, that are so obvious to everyone. The solutions are so obvious, and the things that people are looking to in terms of solutions are the very things that he was pushing for all along. You know, dealing with inequality, increases in the minimum wage, Medicare for all, redoing trade deals in the interest of the workers, and so on and so forth. So it's exhilarating to watch someone like that, you know, capture or recapture people's imaginations, because that's really what he did. He was able to stand in front of thousands and thousands of people and ask them to imagine the world as we could make it together. And that was inspiring. It was exciting. And I'm still inspired by him.
Yeah, we all are. We all are. He was the right person to take on Trump. What next in terms of the political revolution of what we are up against? Because, you know, we talked about the Financial Times article, which is heralding the new age of austerity. We have a tremendous wave of austerity hitting the Eurozone next year, because we don't have sovereign money, as you put it. And as you can see, the powers that be in Europe are effectively loosening up the purse strings in terms of loans. So they will be lending money to Italy, to Greece, to Spain, until the deficit goes to minus 15%, and the debt to GDP ratio grows above 190, 200%. And then, of course, next year they will come around and say, "Come here, you need to consolidate." So the age of austerity in Europe is for certain. I have greater hopes for the United States than I have for Europe, which is not difficult. Where do we go from here?
Well, do you mean where do we go from here, as in what?
Politically, because, you know, intellectually, we know what the arguments are. You know, you will write your article in the Financial Times. I have no doubt you will win the argument. But can we win the war? The war pertaining to the austerian policies that will come through regardless of our intellectual victories, because we had many intellectual victories before. You know, as economists, with the capital controversies back in the 1970s, you know, Jeff Harcourt, whom you mentioned before, and so on. So what? We won the argument, we lost the war. How can we not lose this war? Because, you know, we keep letting good crises go to waste, whereas the fascists on the one hand and the bankers on the other never let a good crisis go to waste.
Yeah, you're depressing me in a lot of different ways, Giannis, because I mean, it's the people who are in power. It's our political leaders, right? How are we going to change who the decision makers are so that different decisions get made? I don't know that all of the organizing and convincing and collective action in the world is going to get us where we all want to go, where you and I want to go, if we have a Boris Johnson in the UK, if we have, you know, the Brazilian president, we have Trump for 4 more years here. So it just seems to me, you know this stuff better than I do, what needs to be done and the various layers with which we have to fight this, because I don't think that there's one clear path. I think that there are many people pushing on many fronts from different angles on many paths that ultimately bring the pressure to bear. And I can't see how it happens without electing inspiring leaders who are willing to take things in a new direction and to break with old shibboleths. And I don't know how else to answer your question except to admit that I don't know.
Well, that is a good way to start. Those people who actually have all the answers are usually dangerous. So, but the simple start of a process leading to an answer must surely be, to band together and to copy what the bankers and the fascists do, to not to concentrate on our own turf, because once we do that, they divide and rule over us. We remember when we met in Vermont in, when was it, November, December 2018, with Bernie and you and many others. We started something we call the Progressive International. We're meeting in Iceland in September, given the wonderful auspices of Katrín Jakobsdóttir, the Prime Minister of Iceland, with people from Africa, from India. I believe that we must turn this into a transnational political rebellion against this, because it's a common fate, really. The more you look at what's happening in the United States, in Greece, in India, in Brazil today, the more you realize that this is a common fate, and the only ones who have not joined forces are the progressives. And it's about time, we change that. So a question from a Greek guy here, judging by his name, Vasilis. Is there any vision of a utopian post-capitalist global society where capital could serve the citizens' needs? And is it possible for it to be fought for so that it becomes true? There.
Yes.
Any question for you?
Yes, I hope the answer is yes. I end my book with a series of just asking the reader to imagine, and it's a refrain, and I do it again and again and again. And that's what I think that this question is about, and that's what my hope is in writing this book. I just wanted to be able to empower people, to empower the reader to fight back against all of the kinds of things that stand in our way of building a better future, building a better world. And the things that I'm trying to knock down are the deficit myths, are all of the arguments that the economists and the people at the Financial Times and others are going to put up as rationales for why we can't get where we're trying to go. These obstacles stand in your way. China, borrowing from China, the grandchildren, the bond vigilantes, the this, the that, crowding out. So I try to clear all of that away, help the reader get empowered. And then the subtitle of the book is Building an Economy for the People. And I don't attempt to say what that should look like. I have my own opinions and ideas of what kind of world I want to live in. My thinking was, if I could help people to see that a different world is possible, and that many of the reasons that we've been told we can't build what we would like to build are not legitimate obstacles, that they're artificial, and that we can safely ignore them and focus on different and real constraints, then we can begin to imagine the kind of world that we could build together. So I think the answer is absolutely yes to the question. It is a matter of building power and then being able to transform the world in the way that we want to live.
Well, one of the viewers has made a point which I think is pertinent. It's not just a question of language, and it's not just a question of metaphors and allegories. There are very powerful vested interests that use those metaphors in order to conceal the extent to which their vested interests are best served by general confusion over the meaning of debt, deficit, money, and so on. And I think it's really important. It's not just a question of failure.
No.
Telling people here in Europe that the German government, for instance, they're not silly. They realize that the majority of Germans would benefit from a different monetary regime, except the oligarchy that's behind them is not going to benefit. So this is always something that is important to remind ourselves of.
Absolutely.
The enemy are not stupid.
I did not mean to suggest that changing the world is as simple as changing language and using different framing and that sort of thing. No, in fact, my last response was, it was about building power, that you've got to build power because you have to take from those who benefit from the current usages and the current myths and reinforcing. I mean, in the book, I talk a lot about Peter G. Peterson, the billionaire hedge fund guy who spent literally a lifetime, decades, building out an entire infrastructure, right, of think tanks, of ways to popularize and reinforce these myths in the pages of the Washington Post, at conferences, with politicians, bringing people in, giving them the talking points, reinforcing these myths around the government's finances, the idea that the government, the debt crisis and so forth being driven by entitlements. It's Social Security, it is Medicare, it is Medicaid, it is the programs that we have designed to care for one another that are fundamentally the problem. And so they want to knock down the last vestiges of the New Deal, the Great Society, sweeping reform of all the social welfare safety nets, such as it is remaining. And so those are the people. It is a power play. And I fully recognize that you have to do more than just change the way that we talk about things in order to win that fight.
I've got one question and one comment coming from our viewers. The question is from Willem, I believe it's from Germany. Do you think the euro will implode? That's the question. And the comment comes from Mirna. I don't know where she's from, but she says, and I think you'll appreciate it, and we got so many messages of that sort, like Mirna's. Thanks so much, Giannis, for bringing Stephanie Kelton on and introducing her to us. We really need people like Stephanie opening our eyes and advising governments like the US government that will result in November. In the meantime, raising profile of women economists like that is the best contribution you could make. So there, I just wanted to read this out for
That's
you.
nice.
Do you think the euro will implode? Because I keep predicting it will, but it doesn't.
Randy Ray and I wrote that paper, I think a decade ago. The title of it was, Can Euroland Survive? And our answer was yes, if. Yes, if. And that's still the answer. Do I think if the currency issuer, the ECB, does what is necessary to hold it together, do I think it will implode? Yeah, I do, because it is obviously not sustainable under the current way in which the ECB and the countries all view themselves vis-a-vis one another as a union. No, you cannot stress these countries and these people. You cannot do to the Greeks, to the Italians, to the Spaniards over a period of years stretching into decades, the misery, the high rates of poverty, the austerity. It's not sustainable. Something will snap. And I think when one country breaks free, that will unleash the whole process.
Or to paraphrase Keynes, the Eurozone can stay alive longer than I can, as Giannis speaking, stay sane, not solvent, but sane. One last question, because we're coming to the close. What do you do to find some solace during these hard times? What do you read, listen to, how do you take your mind off the nasty reality that we are really engulfed in?
I'll tell you, I have two beautiful children who now are home 24 hours a day. My son plays piano, and that's beautiful because periodically, several times a day, usually, he will go down, and that's a very enjoyable part of my day. Yeah, I read all day, so reading doesn't really serve as any form of escape for me. But Family movies. We cuddle up at the end of the night as much as possible. I twist their arms. Last night, I convinced the whole family to watch In Time.
Fantastic movie.
So all of us sat there.
Currency being time, right? How much time is left in you?
That's right. That's right.
I love that movie.
And then we've got, we live on Long Island, and we can pop the kayaks into the water and
come on.
Out and just sort of try to forget all of the things that we're all dealing with.
That sounds too idyllic for these miserable times. But then again, who am I to speak? Then I and our dog live in a fantastic house overlooking the Aegean. Stephanie, I will thank you in a minute, but let me first, while you're still here, introduce the guest for another now next week. Enrico Giovannini is an Italian economist. He's a professor in Rome. He was Minister of Labor and Social Policies between 2013 and 2014. He's a statistician as well. He was president of the Italian Statistical Institute. And he's currently an advisor of the present Prime Minister, Mr. Conte. So Enrico and I are going to have a right old tussle, because I think we're going to disagree quite a lot, while maybe agreeing on some things as well. I don't have to agree with everyone that comes on my program, unlike tonight. Stephanie, it was a great pleasure to have you. There is always a silver lining. If we were not locked down, we would not even have thought of having these chats. I benefited enormously from seeing you. I haven't seen you for a while. It's always good to see you. I hope to see you again soon, maybe in person. But you can have the final word by which today's Another Now will finish.
Well, thank you, Giannis. Thanks for spending an hour with me and letting me join you on the program. And thank you for all of the work that you do, because I have to say that what you're trying to pull off is not easy. And at the same time, I think it is just really critical that we begin to build the kind of movement that you're trying to build, to help point us in a direction where we as a world can survive and thrive together. So I want to thank you for that.
Well, folks, goodbye and good night from this Mutual Appreciation Society of Stephanie and me. See you soon.
Thank you, John.